fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Jules, or as he's more professionally known, Julian Assele, writer and researcher, Twitterer at Catholic Claude, part of the religious left, and one of the few people on the left that I know that comes from a pretty strongly paleo-conservative-esque background. So you and I share an ambivalent relationship to Christopher Lasch. And yesterday, and we were just talking, as we're a member of some long group of people who are fascinated by trying to figure out supply chain logistics and what it means. And you shared an essay that you wrote earlier this year, I think in January, for Arthwart magazine called Abandoning Lasch. And I thought it was interesting because my best friend and co-author, Shalom Van Tyne, and I have been off and on working on a book on Christopher Lasch's legacy where we kind of try to save him from his current popularity. But what I found interesting about your piece is, even though our projects in regards to Lasch almost seem opposite, I'm trying to go back and understand what happened with him, why the late books are the way they are. Is his reception and maintenance by paleo-conservatism, evangelicals, and the Claremont Institute, why did that happen? Why were they the people to preserve his legacy, et cetera, and so forth? But like you, he was an early transitionary figure for me, both into and out of the kind of paleo-conservative right, because he was a Marxist-ish, or a little M-Marxist. He's very,
Marxian.
Yeah. He, in all of his writings, he's very couched about how Marxist he may or may not be. And I've said that now, having read all the books and about half of the articles. He talks about his grasp of dialectics. He never really disagrees with Marx. But he doesn't make a big deal out of his Marxism. He never has seemed to be a sectarian in any way. He doesn't come out of sectarian orgs. His advisor was not a Marxist. His advisor was, in history, was, I believe, William Lichtenberg, and he also worked with Richard Hofstadter. So I think that's interesting. He did a thesis that I have not read called Revolution and Democracy in 1961. He did a dissertation, which became his first book, American Liberals and the Russian Revolution, which is a book that I used to not think was important. Then in my chronological reading of Lasch, went back and read it, and I think it's super important. And so before we really start talking, I want people to understand my particular framework for this and what we talk about here. I have a periodization of Lasch's works based on his books. So I have early Lasch, or Lasch as understanding the long history of the U.S. left. And that's his first four books. So that's the one I just mentioned from 1962, American Liberals and the Russian Revolution, which was his dissertation. His first really big popularly read book was New Radicalism in America, 1889 to 1963, The Intellectual as a Social Type. There's his 1969 book, which is super important, The Agony of the American Left, which actually kind of periodizes and historicizes in a series of essays the development of the American left and the new left as he saw it in 1969. What is fascinating about that book is what everybody blames on the new left. He actually goes and traces all the way back to the end of the 19th century. And he has a class notion for what happens. It's a lot less vulgar than PMC class talk today, and we can go into that if we have time. Then he does World of Nations, which is basically essays that finish up what he didn't cover in The Agony of American Left, like the 50s left's relationship to the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and he basically calls them sellouts and CIA stooges, which is later confirmed that they were. Then Lasch kind of pivots a little bit, and he starts really focusing in on feminism. He'd spent a lot of that first period of books that I'm talking about analyzing feminism, talking about how it begins as like a working class movement, but quickly becomes something else and is largely subsumed by right-wing and capitalist forces early on. And then he really comes down on progressivism, and he has a thesis about that, that progressivism is basically the Brahmin class of like hot bourgeoisie that are pre-industrial, basically realize that they're about to be made irrelevant by the end of industrialization in America and the Great Depression. And they start taking ideas from the populist, the socialist, and the progressive movement and come up with this new Rooseveltian progressivism, which he thinks builds Fordism. He sees Fordism as a maintenance of capitalism. He seems to buy Paul Sweezy's monopoly capital thesis and Frederick Pollock's administrative thesis, which is why he doesn't seem to think that like the contradiction in labor is entirely one of economics. He actually starts to see it as cultural. He's also a cultural historian, which, again, this is one of my warnings to people. When all you have is a hammer, everything seems like a nail, and he does focus a lot on like culture issues. Then he writes Culture of Narcissism, which is more or less his response to development out of and critique of the Frankfurt School, which is something that people don't even realize. That he's basically picking up the thesis of the one-dimensional man and responding to it, trying to defend the working class, but talking about how all these narcissistic values are results of these developments in capitalism, and particularly Fordism. Then he writes The Minimal Self in 1983, 1984, which is just him explaining what he actually meant in the culture of narcissism and talking about how conservatives are misreading it, and it is not some kind of individualistic anti-consumerist tirade, which admittedly without context it does read like it is. And then you have him go into journalism for about 6 years. He gets cancer, starts winding down. And he writes what are his second and third most famous books, The True and Only Heaven, which is a critique of the idea of progress, and The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, which is his most conservative book. And then the last book by him that's released is Woman in the Common Life, which is even more double down on the family stuff. But as I've talked to you about it, he's got throat cancer during this time period, and his daughter, Elizabeth Quinn Lasch, is the person who is tasked with finishing those manuscripts up, editing them together. And according to Lasch's students like Kevin Mattson, who is, so to trace our intellectual lineages, and then I'll finally let you talk. People are like, darn, he's been talking for 10 minutes. He hasn't even let the guest talk. But my relationship to Lasch is from my Periodizing Conservative, but my co-author and my best friend was fascinated by this too, and we used to talk about it all the time because she is the doctoral student, Kevin Mattson, who was the person Lasch assigned to carry on his classes from his own program when he retired with cancer. And according to Kevin Mattson, that it's hard to tell how much influence Elizabeth Quinn Lasch had on the later books, but it is not insignificant. We're not talking about Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche levels of influence, but it is hard to relate the last two books with the rest of Lasch's corpus, and then the last three books. So when I periodized Lasch, the 62 to 73 early Lasch is writing the history of the left, going back into the 17th and 18th century, 19th century, to kind of give a full picture, trying to educate Americans on how all this came to be. There is the cultural critic Lasch, which is 77 through 84. And then there is what I call the full Wendell Berry. If for people who don't know, Wendell Berry is a working class friendly, used to consider himself conservative Christian poet, who's also a naturalist and is kind of a cool guy. He's become less and less conservative communitarian and more just vaguely left liberal as he ages. But during the 80s and 90s, he was part of this communitarian movement. Lasch was considered important to the communitarian movement, but he ultimately rejected them in favor of populism, which, like I said to you off air, was really weird to me because the most pages of the Lasch's early work, particularly in New Radicalism in America, The Agony of the American Left and World of Nations, there are chapters and chapters critiquing attempts to revitalize populism as a failed project. And then there is a subtle critique of populism in the cultural critic period where he basically accuses populism of being culturally narcissistic. So it makes his later writings, particularly True and Only Heaven and the Revolt of Elites, where he kind of sees populism as the way to revitalize something of a labor movement political project. It's very strange considering how much ink he spent in the first 20 years of his writing career attacking it. And this enters your essay. Because you and me come out of the conservative milieu, and you don't mind me outing that, it's in your essay. So, what kind of conservative were you, Jules?
Right. So to kind of give a little background on myself, I basically kind of grew up in like a very transitive, like kind of like poverty. So like raised by, single mother, moved around a lot, spent half of my childhood in foster care. So I kind of entered college kind of liberal-ish. And I remember my foster father buying me a giant box of books because I was telling him how, I'm going to Yale. I'm from South Carolina. I'm just like a dumb guy. I need to like get smarter. And he was like, here, Julian, I bought you all these books that Town Hall recommended. So I read a bunch of Milton Friedman, Walter E. Williams, Thomas Sowell, and I came to Yale just like a full-blown libertarian, but not on the grounds of, I just want to smoke pot, I just want to just be left alone, but on the grounds of like, I think this is what is best for poor people, because like the way they kind of phrase it was like,
you're one of those.
Yeah, like the minimum wage was meant to exclude Black people from the labor market, like that sort of framing of government regulations, which is true in a sense.
Yeah, it is true in a sense.
Yeah, that's true in a sense because, in the progressive movement, but it's also not talking about the whole story. So I quickly left libertarianism, became kind of a conservative because I converted to Catholicism the year before college. And I was always in this very weird place in college where I was like, on the one hand, like socially conservative, but at the same time, I very much had a strong disdain for the Republican Party and its policies towards poor people and working class people. And so I was just dying for some kind of synthesis between, my kind of my values and my kind of economic beliefs. And I don't remember how I came across this, but I came across Christopher Lasch's Revolt of the Elites, and it just shook my entire world. Like, it sounds it sounds super foolish, but it was the first book I read where the author was like, oh, it's all about class. Like, it's not about this, like, the model of, like, kind of the liberal conception of society, which is like a bunch of different interest groups, whether it be race, gender, or class. But like, no, it's like the main framework of society is like the class structure.
Yeah.
And I was just very enthralled with his essays on, for example, like the emergence of the public school system in 19th century America, his deconstruction of the American dream from being one of just upward mobility to being one of like, oh, it's actually about a classless society of like independent craftsmen and farmers. And I was just so like spellbound by this person who, this scholar who had these kind of left-leaning economic sensibilities, which seemed to synthesize that with these kind of, again, socially conservative values. So I was basically like an anti-capitalist throughout my entire time in college. I was very explicitly, oh, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a communist. But as time went on, it became much harder to not adopt the term, because as I read more labor history, more American history, it seemed very apparent to me that there is in fact an irreconcilable kind of contradiction or struggle between those who, basically capitalists and workers, those who own the means of production and those who don't. And the one thing I kind of noticed as I sort of started going down this path towards Marxism and communism was that a lot of my friends started reading more Lasch, a lot of my conservative friends. And at first I was really excited about this because I was like, oh, wow. Like Lasch is kind of like the entry point going down the path to like, socialism essentially. But what I kind of found was most of my friends who read Lasch, most of my conservative friends at least, did not go down that path, did not go down that socialist path. They just sort of took Lasch's kind of cultural critiques in like The True and Only Heaven and Revolt of the Elites, and took his yearning for the independent craftsman and the independent farmer and the kind of early American Republic ideal, but didn't go further than that. And I was kind of weird. I was kind of confused by this. There was a brief period, and I just want to give context here. I'm class of 2020. So freshman year, Donald Trump won. And so in the preceding 3 years of my time in college, there was this very weird moment where a lot of the premises that the Republican Party was founded on were kind of like being questioned, or at least on a superficial level. Like, for instance, the economic free market laissez-faire approach that has typified the Republican Party since the 80s. And I feel like I was kind of raised and found Lasch in that same milieu that many of my conservative friends were. And so my main question when writing this essay was figuring out, so like, number one, why is it that my friends stayed conservative, stayed, if not pro-capitalism, stayed anti-capitalism, but not socialist? And number two, what is it about Lasch's writings, specifically his later two books, True and Only Heaven and Revolt of the Elites, that is at once anti-capitalist, but also frames the narrative of capitalism in such a way that, like, it almost asks you to embrace reaction. that there is no other way than to embrace a kind of bygone era. For example, for Lasch's example being like populism.
Right.
So that's basically why I wrote this essay, as kind of like, what is the thing that I would have wanted me to read in college that would have basically told me, hey, like, Lasch is great and all, but you got to keep in mind these certain flaws, and like, there are perhaps other thinkers who, I don't want to say are better than Lasch, because I feel like that devalues his, genuinely like very good like intellectual contributions, but may have like more incisive critiques of capital than Lasch.
Yeah. So when I read your essay, I was struck by having a similar journey. But one of the things I laughed at, I was like, funnily enough, one of the best answers to late Lasch is early Lasch, which is a strange response. But like, Lasch's particularly the agony of the American left and new radicalism in America. Lasch talks about the critique of public education, the betrayal of the progressive education movement, which he does actively call out in a way that I find refreshing, because he calls it on left terms for being conciliators to both to the war, and betraying a lot of their World War I and World War II stances, and then their incoherence in response to the Russian Revolution. And then he points out that basically the progressive educational model proposed by Dewey is a way to even deeply inculcate people into capitalist values while claiming to do the opposite. And he's right. I mean, and stuff like that. But what I find interesting is he spends so much of his early book demystifying the history of American feminism, the American socialist and labor movement, the Knights of Labor, and what went wrong with the American populist movement. One of the things he says in his early works, particularly in The Agony of the American Left, is that populism tends to have an unsophisticated view of economic elites and what they do, and thus has a tendency to degenerate into conspiracy theories and turn more and more right wing. What I find hilarious is that he basically does the same thing he was critiquing them for in some way in the Revolt of the Elites. Now, he does have a thread that goes all the way through his early books into that book, and that is that he does see the leadership of the American left emerging out of a specific strata of people that are the children of kind of the hot bourgeoisie and 19th century petite bourgeoisie, both, who are, for whatever romantic or reasons, are invested in the labor movement, but right outside of it. And he talks about that in the context of making feminism safer and safer until, the franchise is given out west on conservative grounds. He talks about the taming of early Mormonism. Actually, fascinatingly, he thinks Mormonism reflects working class cultural values, and that includes polygamy, and stuff like that. So he's not as much of a prude as you would read from his later works or his opposition to no-fault divorce and stuff like that. His predictions on no-fault divorce are one of the predictions that I've always been interested in, because it's one of these areas where he's just objectively wrong, but you can kind of see where the cultural conservatism is beginning to show itself. He's correct in his analysis that what feminism is being used for by a lot of business leaders is to actually devalue labor in general.
Yeah.
Both women's work and to drop the wage. And he's, again, not actually wrong about that at all. That was how it was utilized. So So you see all this happen. And I'm not going to put this in the book because I can't prove it, and I don't want to write anything I can't prove in the book. But my theory is that in the mid-'80s, he's met with a left that is at one time trying to resist and at another time trying to adopt the Reagan Revolution. He's dealt with the left that neoliberalized under Carter when he becomes his most famous, which is, the end of the Carter administration, when Cultural Narcissism was released. And he's in academia. And he's increasingly been in academia for, at this point, 30 years. Now, I have what I like to call the PMC on PMC violence problem. I don't think the PMC is a coherent class, but if you're an academic and those are the people that you deal with, and you see how much semi-control over the culture that they have, whoever they are, and you tend to then take the Barbara Ehrenreich New Left position that somehow anyone with a degree will become PMC, something that, again, Lasch actually criticizes when he talks about all the new class theories around students. He's like, "Oh, this is nonsense." He writes this in the early 70s, like they're not particularly radical. He said it's people in search of an easier to mobilize group. He writes all this stuff. But I think he got burnt out dealing with that specific group of people, particularly when he was writing about like the problems of education and the problems of the way women, like single mothers have been incorporated into the workplace in ways that don't seem to help them or their children. And he says, look, conservatives are speaking to real problems. The left is unpopular amongst the working class now because it's increasingly just this radical, these kind of intellectual radicals who are from a very specific substrata that's existed in the United States for a long time, and that they're not particularly connected to any organic social movements, but they've always kind of parasitically glommed onto them. And then they tried to, in the work of the Frankfurt School, throw the working class under the bus. So clearly we need a new, and this is the turn. In an article called Why the Left Has No Future, he says this explicitly, that the left has doubled down in defending things that are unpopular or by marching into the institutions to hide themselves and integrate themselves into this radical class that he was talking about. Thus further alienating themselves from mass politics, which I think during the age of the Atari Democrats, we got to put this in context. That's a pretty fair accusation because like he's arguing with militant Trotskyists who are defending the Soviet Union in weird ways, but seem to be completely removed from, he's like, you guys have no purchase with common people whatsoever. And then he's like debating basically with the beginnings of girl boss feminism. And around this time, he comes up with this idea that the only way to save the left is to embrace a working class traditionalism, and the only people who could possibly do that are the populists. And then that's when you get for the first time his answer to the problem, and that's what you get in the Revolts of the Elites. Instead of just critiquing their inability to like understand the working class and get into this, you get this idea that like, well, the working class itself didn't remain loyal to its artisan Republican roots, and we should go back to that. And by this point, I'm like, there's no longer any kind of understanding of economic development that was in the earlier books. And so I partially think that he is deliberately engaging in myth making to come up with an alternative to tradition to spur a new political movement that doesn't exist. I've never seen him say that outright, and I've read most of his articles. That if you look at that's the only way I can explain that inconsistency in those last 3 books that we talked about, 2 of which are posthumous. And the kind of Lasch that you always meet. And what's weird is the Lasch that most leftists I know like as the same Lasch that your conservative friends like. They like
Mhm.
the late Lasch, the anti-PMC Lasch, the why can't we go back to cultural labor, Mark Fisher Lasch.
Right.
And as the person who published the Vampire Castle essay, and who has always been weird about how that essay is beloved, but people don't understand it, or the debate it was really around, which is why can't we support Russell Brand? So I was always like, you guys realize that that's all that essay is really, but the critique made there is interesting because in Lasch I see a figure from a time period where the left is so decimated that there's this one guy kind of holding on to it, but he's moving more and more right wing in response to how useless like the postmodern, post-sectarian 80s and early 90s left is. And that left really was useless. Like I gotta you've dated yourself, Jules. I forgive you, but you are probably 20 years younger than me. I was laughing though because your description of like your relationship to conservatism sounds very much like mine. Working class kid. Now I was a reader before I went to college, but I didn't go to Yale. I'm gonna shame you about that later. And I'm not a Catholic convert. I come from a Catholic Jewish mixed family, but because of that, I know Catholic intellectual traditions really well. I got Ron Dreyer-fied before it was cool. And for similar reasons that you did, like I saw the left at the end of the Clinton years in particular as not speaking to anything related to the working class, and also really not really speaking to people of color either at that time period. And then not like you have to pick one or the other, but we weren't even into the point of like United Colors of Benetton progressivism. It was basically like it's full neoliberal democracy. Let's gut welfare, but throw in additional training programs. Let's try to outright the right, but do it with a gentler face. I'm going to make Ross Perot seem progressive. And stand by standards. And it also did seem like, and it seemed even more true during the aughts, that the left was kind of a New York, San Francisco project, and it had nothing to say to people like me from Georgia. All right, it's funny. We're both also Southern people. Trust us, but Southerners are known for our politeness. We'll also shoot you for no reason. So, but you might not. You're probably like New South Reformed, but I'm of the days when the Klan still roamed the streets freely. So,
I'm much more of a New South guy. I mean, even like, because I'm from upstate South Carolina.
You're barely Southern.
Yeah, I'm. Yeah, like I'm from the. I am from the part of the South that was incredibly like very, very heavily Klansman, because that's where like kind of the hill country starts. Like Appalachia really starts getting in there, and even then, my part was way past when the Klan was even a thing. I mean, I'm sure like, are you from like Are you from like what part of Georgia are you from?
I'm from Central Georgia. So I'm from Macon. I'm from de-industrial. I'm from the part of Georgia that's recent economic history sounds like the upper Midwest and not the South. So it was paper mills and manufacturing plants. Then it was YKK and Geico and Brown and Williamson. Then Brown and Williamson left, and then it was just YKK and Geico and city work.
Yeah.
And the town went from like the second to third largest city to like the fifth or sixth, mostly black, area, surrounded, rural, ex-urban, very like Confederate flags everywhere when I was a kid, and actually,
1,000%.
Klan issues were a real problem. Although, to be fair, like by the 80s, the Klan is dying. I mean, the third Klan is really not that. But this is like the time period where like David Duke is a national figure and almost winning for the GOP, and Pat Buchanan and Pat Robertson both ran for president in the same primary in the GOP. I mean, like that's the time period from like 86 to the mid 90s that I come from. And my mother was a conservative Democrat, and my father, my dad, who's my adoptive father, but he was a mechanic, ex petit bourgeois, turned back into working class. He used to own a tool shop, so so even when he was petit bourgeois, he was blue collar. Who was a Reagan skeptic, but probably voted for them. I was old school enough, though they didn't tell their kids who they voted for. But was a like Ross Perot supporter in 92 and 96. So that's the kind of political milieu I came out of. Libertarians and conservatives were battling there because they weren't natural allies the way they were in other parts of the country than the Reagan coalition, because there's nothing particularly libertarian about Southern conservatives. They were all Democrats until the late 90s anyway.
Yeah. From what I've like read, because I've been doing a lot of readings on like post-war political economy, a lot of the thing that a lot of the main issue around which like libertarians and conservatives united around, this was like mostly true after the 50s, was around like the rights-based language that came out of the like home ownership. So for instance, I don't know if you've read this book, White Flight by I think Kevin Cruz, but he kind of goes over how you start to see this new middle class born out of like the working class in Atlanta, where for the first time they have access to like owning their own homes. So like the suburbs in Atlanta just like explode.
They explode and they become sundown towns almost immediately.
Oh yes, absolutely. And there's this thing where like a lot of people, and this was a big conversation when I was.
Book is triggering to me because I literally grew up through the end of it. Like I'm like I saw the end of this happen. Like
yes. So like when I was like in college, it was like this weird thing of like kind of conservatives versus libertarians. And there's this question of like, well, what united conservatives and libertarians? And a lot of the answer was like, they didn't like the libs, or they didn't like communists.
I was about to say they were both anti-communist and they both had like natural rights theories of property, kinda. But
right. But like the big thing that I've kind of figured like reading all this stuff about mid 20th century housing policy is that a lot of the reason why you saw this connection is because you see these white working class people going to these suburbs, they buy their own house, and they're really afraid black people are going to move in because a lot of their wealth is built into their homes. And so you start to see the transition between the more uglier kind of forms of racism, so like the Klan, the Minutemen, the Silver Shirts, whatever, to more respectable like homeowners associations who are like, the government is infringing on your right to like private property or your freedom to associate with whomever you choose, and that sort of thing. And that connected really well with the libertarians, and that's a lot of where that comes from.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because the one of the things that I remember that was part of the shock Varn out of being a crazy paleo-conservative was the number of Neo-confederates. Now, now, I still get a little iffy about people who go all Sherman love on me because all these people love William Tecumseh, and I'm like,
Native Americans, and he horrible shit in the West.
Yeah, he did horrible shit to the West. Also, like, he hated black people. He just really also hated Southerners for starting the war more.
Yeah, he's not Benjamin Butler.
No. I mean, like he wanted to honor, the 40 acres and a mule just to fuck the planter class, which trust me, the planter class deserved it and should have been fucked way harder than they were. And in that scenario, I tend to, like, when people get all soft about Sherman, I tend to be, but I have always had a mixed response to Lincoln, for example, because I was like, if you weren't so pragmatic, maybe the radical Republicans would have had more influence, and you wouldn't have tried to keep the Copperheads in the coalition, and then Johnson wouldn't have totally screwed everything that you believed in and fucked the South real hard for a long time and treated us basically as an occupied
like a
country.
colony.
Yeah, while also not really doing shit for black people. So, like, that was my perspective. And so, some of the Neo-Confederates were adjacent to that because they like to talk shit about Lincoln, and I also, I come to the weird stance now that actually of the American presidents that people get weepy out about, the only one that actually kind of earned it is Lincoln.
Yeah,
but he should have been way more radical, way more ambitious, and you have to deal with a lot of stuff, like the fact that it took the 13th Amendment for abolition to really matter, that the Emancipation Proclamation is a fucking joke. Like, it literally only frees slaves in areas where the United States doesn't have legal power. It's bizarre. But so these Neo-Confederates would show up and kind of get in, and there was weird overlaps. Like, sure, you come out of Catholic circles. You know about Thomas Wood?
We didn't talk about Thomas Wood. Who is he? Is he he's not an integralist, is he?
No. He's actually the integralists are the integralists coming back are a new phenomenon in the past decade. What I find interesting is, like, Thomas Wood, which was this Lew Rockwell ultra, like, paleo-libertarian, so paleo-conservatism plus libertarian hybrid thought. Like, Catholic Church is great and it invented capitalism. And I'm like, that's a weird claim. Like, we have to fight with Max Weber for attributing capitalism to the dirty Protestants. That's, where we're at. And so that was the kind of way radical Catholic intellectuals were going at the time. And Lasch was a huge part of that world. But from the mediating influence of people like Ron Dreyer. And what I think people don't, Ron Dreyer's, kind of he's a quietist integralist. So basically, like, as I like to explain it, like, he thinks that, like, Patrick Deneen and all that project is not going to work. He never thought it was going to work because he's like, America's not a Christian country, basically they're going to kill you eventually. If you try to actually make it a Catholic theocracy, you should join up me in the Orthodox Church, and we should hang out in the woods and let the world burn. But before the Benedict option made that obvious that was his stance, he was the kindler, friendlier front of the anti-war right if you weren't in the Justin Raimondo, Lew Rockwell spear, and you were trying to get out of the uglier parts of the Pat Buchanan spear, like Joe Sobran and Richard Spencer later. I mean, because people don't know that, like, not Mr. Nazi himself used to work for AMCOM in the period that American Conservative Magazine was most read by leftists and liberals, because it was anti-war when the Democrats were running around trying to figure out how they were going to respond to their own war votes.
You're trying to salute the flag.
Yeah, they were trying to both salute the flag and being anti-war at the same time, which eventually pays off for them in 2006. But during the entire time that I'm, my early 20s, it's just like, I'm like, the neoconservatives are taking everything over. They're far more aggressive. And what I found interesting is that the liberals and left at the time thought they were fighting the moral majority, right? And so they thought they were fighting like the 80s, 90s Reagan coalition evangelicals. They thought they were fighting like Rushdunian crypto dominionists and stuff like that, and they weren't. And if people don't know the names that I'm mentioning, good for you, because we're 1,000 years from that, even though it was only 20 years ago. And Lasch spoke to me because I also had this experience of like liberal humanities graduates, elites who came from New England and the upper Midwest, and were always telling me how racist they were when they grew up in totally white neighborhoods. I mean, racist we were when they grew up in totally white neighborhoods, and would just say idiotic things. And someone like Lasch really appealed to me for the same reason that he appealed to you, is you had a counter narrative, and you had this early republic. There was not the same early republic that the libertarians sold you, or the Neo-confederates sold you. Like,
it's the secret history they don't want you to know.
Mm-hmm. Like about the yeoman artisans and everybody thinking they're a yeoman, which is a criticism, ironically, that Engels makes of Americans, that like they don't have proper class consciousness because this whole yeoman thing has screwed up the working class's relationship to itself, and the government can steal land and relieve the pressure by the yeoman myth plus stolen land and this and ever expanding settlements, which really does stave off the development of the economic left until you hit California, and that is when the populist movement and the socialist movement really explode, because there's really no more land to steal to pay people off with. And it's actually funny how quickly that whole stolen land thing doesn't work. Like, it's like, okay, it buys time for like 20 years. Like,
there's this really funny thing. I don't know if you've read it. It's Daniel Walker Howe's book, What God Hath Wrought, which is like kind of like the favored general history of Jacksonian America right now. It's in the Oxford series on American history. And he has this great passage where he's like, yeah, like we have this conception of like Americans being these really great yeoman farmers and they're independent. But not only were they like not that, because a lot of these people lived in like not really self-sufficient, like these communities were kind of self-sufficient, but not exactly. But they weren't even good at it. Like how recounts how so many Americans, they get like a plot of land, let's say in Georgia, and they run the soil into the ground. And after like 2 years, they're like, oh, I didn't make a profit, I'm going to move on. And they go to the next plot of land, and they're basically wasting all of the land that the government stole for them from the Native Americans. And you read this and you're like, how does Christopher Lasch think like this is what we should embrace? Because I've read, since becoming a communist, I've read a bunch of like labor history, histories of like the American labor movement, Marxist theories, that sort of thing. One of my favorite ones that really made me think this is insane was have you read Harry Braverman at all?
Yeah, I've read Braverman.
Capital. I remember reading it and I was like, wow, this is like a really great kind of counter narrative to like Lasch's like history of, I guess, technology, or like what we could do against technology, because Braverman is very much like, yeah, this technology is essentially used to de-skill workers and to break down their jobs into constituent parts. And I look at the back of the cover, and do you want to know who I find one of the people I find complimenting the book? It's Christopher Lasch.
Yeah, Lasch knows this history.
Yeah, I'm like, why did he write this? He knows this stuff.
That's why I have this. Sean and I are in disagreement about this, but I literally think that Tikkun editorial, and then his repudiation of the right, which is what the right gets wrong, which he writes. These are both in Tikkun Volume 1, so they're the first year. I think it's in issue 2 and issue 4. They're not easy to find anymore. I found them on the Wayback Machine for my research on the book. but I think he's deliberately trying to construct a cultural myth.
Yeah.
That he doesn't actually entirely believe in those last two books. Or maybe Elizabeth Quinn Lasch is doing it. Although the more I've read about her, I don't think that's true. I think she does have a different politics. Her politics is very classics derived. She's very like, her most recent book is Ars Vitae, which is like the defense of like classical liberal arts and this and the other, which has always been given to this Republican like this early Republicanism myth, yeoman farmer myth. But what I find interesting about this, and this was where this is not issue where Shallon and I argued a lot. I was like, where does Lasch's notion of the working class come from? Because it seems weirdly cultural.
Yeah, no, that's the other thing. I was rereading Revolt of the Elites before writing this essay, and the one thing I noticed that I obviously didn't notice when I was in college, because I was not a Marxist then, was how little he talks about profit as the guiding force of capital. And much more than that, I think, much more important is how almost every mention of profit in that book is laden with speculative profit. Like Lasch's big critique of capital is less that it's like a vampire on the blood of like living labor. It's like, Marx's critique. But it's the fact that, we don't produce anything anymore. We're unmoored from production. We don't produce real things. And, this connects with his critique of the elite class in America in the first, I think, essay, which is, these are people for whom noblesse oblige no longer exists. Say what you will about the aristocrats, the land-based aristocrats, but they stayed in one place and they had a sort of obligation to their like tenants and whatnot, which is very much complicated by the fact that, at least in antebellum society, especially in the rice plantations in like low country South Carolina, a lot of slave plantations were just like absentee landlords.
Yeah, they're not there.
Yeah, they're not even there.
Like the planter class was the richest. I think people do not, because they know that the South is poor, but they don't realize that like before the carpetbaggers came and drained us, to turn I'm going to turn full Southern for a second. Before the carpetbaggers came and drained us, there's a real sense in which the planter class came and drained us. They were absentee aristocratic landlords who used race and they are, I think Marx's an inability to figure out, like, so in classical Marxism, slavery is a different mode of production, but actually if you read Marx is very ambivalent about that, because he sees how much capital is being accumulated. And again, a lot of people throw this at Marxists now. It's like, Marx didn't realize how slavery was. Yeah, he did, actually. He writes explicitly about it, and particularly in his letters to Lincoln, but also like trying to get what would become the first international to take the Civil War in the United States seriously, because like, look, there are these weird aristocratic holdovers that are somehow using slavery to transition to a more barbaric form of capitalism than we've even dealt with. And so Marx is ambivalent about whether or not it's capital, but he still he sees a real possibility there.
I mean, people don't really talk about, and many people don't really talk about this, but I'm very grateful for the recent wave of scholarship that's come out in the past 30 years, where like you have a lot of antebellum historians coming in, and they're all basically like writing books that are basically fuck yous to Genovese. Whereas with Genovese, he's like, yeah, like with the planter class, they have this paternalistic kind of ideology towards the slaves. Now, granted, in role, Genovese isn't directly arguing that like slavery is a pre-capitalist form of political economy.
No, but that's actually the slaveholders themselves that argue that. That's a whole different thing. But
yeah, exactly. But like, you have a lot of these scholars who are like, no, yeah, like the slave owning class, they were basically capitalists LARPing as like chivalric knights, medieval knights, essentially. Like they had these codes of chivalry, they had this kind of noblesse oblige about them, but they're actually on the cutting edge of accounting, of transforming the land for the sake of capital, for valorization.
I think I love this. I was ambivalent for a long time to some of this new research on this, but I've come around. Partly because I think Marx does not have, like Marx has a stagist conception of history in so much that he thinks that the wealth produced by capital would make recapitulating the kind of conditions in early communism possible without the starvation requisites that made us give up primitive communism in the first place. Like, that's it. And, a lot of people are like, well, Marx has this Lapsarian ideology. And I'm like, no, Marx's description of primitive communism actually doesn't even make it sound that fun. Like, but he does seem to think, particularly by the 1850s, 1860s, that there are other ways in which capitalist modernity and also socialism could emerge because of capitalism's already existing prior productive capacity, which people could parasite on or tie into new things. And he is terrified of that being tied into slavery and winning in the Americas. What I find interesting about Lasch devotes an inordinate amount of time praising Black radicalism in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then critiquing the Black Power movement for being incoherent, basically along the lines of Harry Cruz in the Problems of the Negro Intellectual. Then he critiques Harry Cruz for like your Black cultural nationalism isn't going to work because basically you're picking diaspora communities that have a home state that they're supporting, and you don't have a home state or a unified culture. But then all that discussion of race in Lasch's work, like even in the middle period stuff, like Haven and a Heartless World, The Culture of Narcissism, and the Minimal Self, kind of falls away. I don't know why that is. I wonder. Part of it is I think he doesn't entirely see, like, the thesis that Black people are not working class because they're systemically kept in the reserve army of labor and thus semi-lumpenized is something that he kind of accepts from Cleaver. And that was why, this whole part of the 60s, like why people thought that, are the lumpen good or bad? Because look, the Black people are on our side. They might be the advanced part of the proletariat, but they're lumpenized, so we don't know.
Right.
And I think Lasch is writing in response to that. And then by the end of his life, it doesn't come up at all. I mean, like the weird absence of these discussions that are huge in the beginning. His biographer is an evangelical Christian. Something I pointed to you off air, but I thought it's weird that the only authorized biographer is the evangelical Christian. So it's like, did Lasch have this deathbed reversion to like Protestantism and give up Marx? And I can't find evidence of it. But he is ambivalent when he talks about God. Like he doesn't seem to be an atheist. But it's not that important to him, like at all. But I will say he does quote Reinhold Niebuhr more and more and more towards the end of his life. But I think that what came out of my conversation with you about your essay, because I'm like, yeah, your essay is totally accurate about the problems of late Lasch. This whole like yeoman, it's completely made up. He also, it's not completely made up. He's not lying, but he's omitting so much. And the
like
thing
slavery,
is,
like native genocide.
Yeah. The thing is, he knows that and has written about it. That's what blows my mind. So the only thing I can figure is this is him going cynical Windleberry, which is something I never further, and he's trying to invent a race neutral so that both black and white proletarian can adopt to it myth that isn't tied into progress.
Right.
But because the other thing is his true and only heaven, progress and its critics, and he ends up siding with the critics. What I find fascinating about that book is for all that he's like wagging at how lame postmodernists are, he makes the same argument they do.
Yeah.
Like, basically that teleology is bad, and it's more or less an unnecessary meta narrative, and I'm always like, yeah, but Marxist teleology was never unilaterally progressive. It's not Whiggish, but it's also not denying there's benefits to capital.
Yeah.
And so I just came away and like why to use the kind of a critique that Marx issues in such a way. I don't use it much anymore because it's almost insulting that people don't understand what you mean, but it's undialectical. It only sees the bad. It doesn't see any of the other developments, and Lasch seems to posit that it's possible in his last three works to go back to this yeoman mentality.
Yeah, this is the big point that I make in my essay, which is like, there's a part in True and Only Heaven where Lasch almost admonishes the IWW or like the different labor unions for opening up their ranks to unskilled laborers. Like maybe admonish is not the right word because I don't think he does that, but more like laments the fact that they have to do that because that directs more energy towards defending unskilled trades rather than defending this old way of craftsmanship. And it's like
it's like a praise for guild unions, which is bizarre.
Yeah. And like you say, it's undialectical in the sense that like Lasch levies this critique, but does not acknowledge the other problems that, say, Taylorism brings up. Like the very fact that the problem with Taylorism is that it's a very fragile system. Like if there's a part of the production process that, for example, goes wrong or if workers refuse to do work, that stops the entire process. And you see this like today, like the way with capital, or like the way that capital kind of goes, and this is something that Marx points out, is that it is a world historical phenomenon in as much as it forces people to depend on each other. Meaning that if anything goes wrong in, for example, a logistics supply chain or in the production process, that screws up a lot of other places, not just in the production or supply chain process, but in a geographical sense. But for Lasch, the way he phrases this is like, oh, like with all these unskilled jobs and trying to defend these unskilled jobs, that's a losing game because you're on terms that you cannot win.
Right. Which is what's so weird about that is objectively this is the area of late Lasch from like, that's just objectively false. And your own historical work where he defends, like, he does talk about like the Knights of Labor, their camaraderie and their inability to strike even early on, but he actually kind of waggles his finger in his 60s work at that. Like he's like, that was a problem. And he points out like why industrial unionism was necessary, but they needed to do it along the lines of like the CIO and not the lines of the IWW.
Right.
And he praises Eugene Debs in his early work. And that's inconsistent.
It is.
Because it's totally inconsistent with this late work, because Debs' whole fucking thing was that guild unionism was reactionary. It was portrayed in craft. It was basically protectionist craft guilds, and it made the base and the collective actor of the work of the labor smaller and smaller units of people, and that you had to expand that to be able to build a via labor politics, which was proven in Europe, particularly in Germany, and also like what he praised about the SPA. And so I was kind of like, Lasch, what's up? And the other thing that he does, I mean, there are, even his early stuff, there's weird silences. Like he doesn't talk about the SPUSA much. He talks about it a little bit, but mostly in regards to its relationship to like black cultural nationalism, actually, because it people may not know this, but like the reason why you keep on hearing about all these artists in the Black community that became like famous Black artists like Richard Wright all being communist, and even though they all give it up and like turn on communism, except for like Lorraine Hansberry, who doesn't live long enough to really do that, is because also the CPUSA was the safest way to have a career in culture in the Black community in the 40s and 50s, because they would patronize Black arts as part of their Black Belt thesis, even though labor history interestingly has indicated the Black Belt thesis was never popular amongst Black people, which is kind of interesting.
Really?
Yeah, that's a focus of leadership, but it was not a focus of it was not heavily supported by actual rank and file Black communists. That was like a Black communist leadership position more than like the Black members of the TUL and the communist part of the CIO. They were not big on the Black Belt thesis, which is interesting.
Yeah, because I read Robin Kelly's book Hammer and Hoe, and he doesn't mention this. I'm just now hearing this.
Yeah, I did an interview with Victor Devonetz, who's a scholar of early 20th century, scholar of labor history in general, but early 20th century labor in particular. And he talks about new research that updates the same stuff that Kelly was working on, looking at not just what we have evidence that the leadership believed, but what we have evidence that like membership believed. And Black nationalism was not widely adopted until basically the late 50s and 60s. And by that point, the Black Belt thesis and stuff has been abandoned by the CPUSA because they're in the Popular Front, and you can't be advocating for that and be in the Democratic Party with the Dixiecrats in the same party. Like, you just can't. So it's an interesting contradiction, right? Well, Lasch skips his history. I don't know if it's because he doesn't know it. And so there are things that are suspect in early Lasch that kind of reflect some stuff in later Lasch. But the stuff about like loving guild unions he does say some weird things about sharecropper. What I was going to say about his cultural definition of working class, he seems to buy the thesis. And I don't know if it's coming from Sweezy or Pollock, but if you think about what Marxists in America thought at that time, almost everybody thought, a la Bukharin, that we were in a state capital, monopoly capital period, and that maybe the contradictions of capitalism have actually been solved and we were in a new class structure. And that's where this PMC, that's where the managerial thesis, that's where the administrative state thesis, all these kind of weird theses. What my friend Stephen Hamill and I point out is they all basically assume M to MC prime is not functioning anymore. For those who don't know, Marx basically like it assumes that we're not being driven by profits, which is what you noticed. Well, that's actually kind of a common assumption amongst all these Marxists in academia at the time. Right. All right, so that's not unique to Lasch, but it's interesting because I think a lot of people misread the 77 through 84 Lasch. So that's that middle period, the other famous work that's not this kind of reactionary work. I would even say it's hard to call the betrayal of the Revolt of the Elites reactionary, except that it does seem interested in positing a past that wasn't that maybe not is completely false, but it's overly simplified, right?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think my problem, and I think you mentioned this, is like Lasch, or at least the theory is that Lasch wants to engage in some myth making because he thinks that is the thing that could possibly save the left. Which, I want to be frank here. Like, I mentioned this in the end of my essay. Like, I don't begrudge Lasch for his intellectual trajectory, specifically because he lived through the exact period of the left where they were just taking just L.
It's like the shittiest period of the
Yeah,
left history.
L
Like,
after L after L. Like, you know, me as a Zoomer, like I complain about the left like a good bit, but it could not possibly be like more hopeless than what Lasch lived through. And
yeah,
so,
I was about to say, there's a reason why Gen Xers are more reactionary than everybody else. It's like because the left wasn't even a viable thing in like the 80s and 90s. Like,
yeah, so I get the myth making, but the problem I think is that Lasch operated under the assumption, and I operated under the assumption too, when I was in that period of being an anti-capitalist but not yet a Marxist, that I could possibly trick conservatives into becoming leftist or anti-capitalist by positing this socially conservative anti-capitalist chronology of the past. And as somebody who still has a lot of conservative friends from college, that never works.
Yeah, it doesn't. And this is why I'm always like, post-leftist, stop this shit. Like, and anti-left Marxist, stop it. You're not gonna form some coalition with the. I mean, and what's weird is Lasch kind of knows that, because as soon as he always makes a concession, he'll write like an article like why the right is wrong or why the right misunderstands me or whatever. There's several of these in the 80s from 81 forward. I just find more and more of them. But it is telling that when I look from 95 to 2005, all right, it's that time period, and I'm researching secondary sources on Lasch, it's New Criterion, it's City Journal, it's American Conservative Magazine, it's the Evangelical Biographer, it's the Claremont Institute. Even sympathetic left communitarian communists don't really pick him up. And so we have the double bind of this weird turn that we're talking about at the end of his life, which I do think is a turn that has some consistency with the past, but you also have to ignore a lot of his own writing for this in period to make sense, because everyone's like, well, Lasch is pro-populist, and until I reread everything, I'm like, oh, if you just start with the end stuff, you think he is by the last 2 books or 3 books, but he's not in the other 9, like at all. And so you just, something kind of clicked, and I don't want to get too biographical in this, because I'm also like doing additional biographic research on Lasch to try to figure out what happened. And I think some of that, psychologically someone's not fair, but something happened and he felt like he needed to come up with a traditionalism for labor to base a new labor politics on, and thus a kind of post-left on. And the only people who pick it up are non-libertarian conservatives. And and then basically leftists who are trying to argue with the libs in the late aught-teens pick up the paleo-conservative version of Lasch, but ignore the really, really useful, interesting scholar of American leftism for its first 200 years, Lasch. It's really wild to try to push this together. I'm going to have to, we're running out of time for the show today, but Jules, I'm going to invite you back on very soon. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, in light of your essay, I'm going to send you that Tikkun essay that I think is a turning point, and we can talk about it in specific, and maybe people can get a tighter idea of what we're talking about. Are you up for that?
I would love to, because as I said before, Lasch has his flaws, but love him or hate him, he is the man who started me on my path to Marxism.
Right. He kind of was for me too. So I have this whole I have a now, to use a terrible term, dialectical response where I'm like, I have to distance myself from this paleo conservative view of Lasch that's very consistent with his late work, but also be like, yeah, but there's a lot of good shit in there, particularly in the early work, and I don't know how to reconcile the two. So I think we're gonna dig into that, Why the Left Has No Future from 86 from Tikkun, and we'll kind of talk there. Thank you so much for coming on.
Of course.
People can find you at Catholic Claude. Catholic Claude.
Catholic Claude, CLOD.
Yeah, Catholic Claude on Twitter, and they can find your writings under your name, which is going to be in our show notes. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.